Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a small New England village where fear became more powerful than reason, where neighbors turned against neighbors, and where a chain of accusations transformed ordinary lives into a nightmare. Tonight, we explore the dark truth behind the Salem Witch Trials, one of the most disturbing episodes in early American history. So dim the lights, settle into your favorite chair, and prepare to travel into a world where suspicion spread faster than facts, and where a single whisper could become a death sentence. The winter of 1692 settled heavily over Salem Village in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Snow covered the fields, icy winds swept through narrow roads, and darkness seemed to arrive earlier with each passing day. Life in this corner of New England was already difficult. Families worked relentlessly simply to survive. Crops could fail. Disease could appear without warning. Harsh weather threatened livelihoods every year. For the people living there, the world was not divided neatly between natural and supernatural explanations. Most residents sincerely believed that God actively influenced daily life. They also believed that Satan constantly searched for opportunities to corrupt humanity. Invisible spiritual forces felt just as real to them as storms, illnesses, and hunger. Salem itself was not a peaceful community before the witch trials began. Beneath the surface existed years of tension. Some families argued over property boundaries. Others disagreed about politics, taxes, or religious leadership. Economic differences created resentment. Certain residents prospered while others struggled. Old grudges quietly accumulated. At the center of many disputes stood the village minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. His arrival had divided the community. Some villagers supported him strongly. Others criticized his leadership and resented his demands regarding salary and benefits. Arguments about religion increasingly blended with personal conflicts. Inside the Parris household lived several individuals whose lives would soon alter history. Among them were 9-year-old Betty Parris, the minister's daughter, and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, a relative who lived with the family. During the cold months of early 1692, strange events began unfolding around them. At first, the behavior seemed merely unusual. The girls complained of mysterious sensations. They screamed unexpectedly. They threw themselves across rooms. Sometimes they hid beneath furniture. Witnesses described moments when they appeared unable to control their movements. Their bodies twisted into uncomfortable positions. They cried out as if invisible forces tormented them. Family members became alarmed. Local doctors examined the children. One physician reportedly found no obvious physical explanation. Without a clear medical cause, attention quickly turned toward supernatural possibilities. In a deeply religious society, many people considered witchcraft a genuine threat. Rumors began circulating. Soon, additional young girls exhibited similar symptoms. They cried, trembled, and claimed to suffer attacks from unseen entities. As concern spread through Salem Village, residents demanded answers. If witches were responsible, someone needed to identify them. Pressure mounted on the afflicted girls. Who was harming them? Who served the devil? Who threatened the community? Eventually, names emerged. The first accused included 3 very different women. One was Sarah Good, a poor beggar who often wandered through the village seeking food and assistance. Another was Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman involved in local disputes and viewed suspiciously by some neighbors. The third was Tituba, an enslaved woman living in the Paris household. Each stood outside Salem's social comfort zone in different ways. Sarah Good frequently irritated residents when she requested charity. Sarah Osborne rarely attended church and had become entangled in property disagreements. Tituba's background and outsider status made her vulnerable to suspicion. Once accusations began, events accelerated rapidly. Villagers questioned the women intensely. Officials sought confessions. Community members watched closely. Sarah Good denied involvement in witchcraft. Sarah Osborne denied involvement as well. Tituba, however, delivered statements that electrified Salem. Accounts differ regarding exactly how her confession developed, but reports indicated that she described encounters with dark forces and claimed that multiple witches operated within the colony. She spoke of strange creatures, mysterious books, and supernatural conspiracies. Whether these claims emerged from fear, coercion, survival instincts, or some combination of all 3 remains debated by historians. What mattered at the time was their impact. The confession appeared to confirm people's worst fears. Many residents already believed that Satan actively worked against godly communities. Now they felt they possessed evidence. If one witch existed, perhaps many others existed as well. The accusations multiplied. People who previously seemed respectable suddenly found themselves under suspicion. Established church members were named. Farmers were named. Mothers, daughters, widows, and laborers became targets. Fear created its own momentum. Every new accusation appeared to validate previous accusations. Every arrest reinforced the belief that an enormous conspiracy lurked beneath Salem's ordinary appearance. As winter slowly gave way to spring, legal proceedings expanded. Magistrates conducted examinations in crowded rooms filled with anxious spectators. The accused often faced impossible situations if they denied witchcraft. Some observers interpreted their denial as deception. If they confessed, their confession appeared to confirm the existence of witches. Meanwhile, the afflicted girls continued presenting dramatic symptoms during hearings. Witnesses described episodes where they screamed, fainted, or claimed invisible attacks occurred directly before their eyes. Many spectators considered such displays convincing evidence. Modern observers might search for psychological explanations, social pressures, group behavior, or medical possibilities. Yet, the people of Salem lived within a different intellectual framework. Most participants genuinely believed they confronted a spiritual crisis. The courtroom atmosphere became increasingly intense. An accused individual could enter a hearing already burdened by rumors. Once testimony began, neighbors sometimes recalled strange incidents from years earlier. A sick cow, a failed crop, an unexplained illness. Events previously considered unfortunate accidents suddenly acquired sinister interpretations. Memories changed under the influence of fear. Coincidences became evidence. Personal conflicts transformed into accusations. Suspicion expanded beyond any single household. Among those eventually accused was Martha Corey, a respected church member whose case shocked many villagers. Her reputation initially seemed incompatible with witchcraft allegations. If someone like Martha Corey could be accused, then almost anyone could become vulnerable. The boundaries separating safety from danger grew thinner each week. Families whispered about the latest arrests. Children listened nervously to conversations around fireplaces. Travelers carried stories from one settlement to another. The colony watched Salem with growing fascination and concern. What had started with a handful of troubled girls was evolving into something far larger. Authorities believed they faced a hidden enemy. The afflicted believed they suffered genuine torment. The accused struggled to defend themselves against invisible crimes. And Salem Village continued descending into a climate where fear overshadowed caution. By the time spring deepened, prisons began filling with suspects awaiting trial. Chains rattled behind stone walls. Families worried about loved ones. Neighbors wondered whether they might be named next. No one yet understood how far the crisis would spread. No one yet realized how many lives would be destroyed before the panic ended. And as more accusations emerged from every direction, one chilling reality became impossible to ignore. The witch hunt was only beginning. The witch hunt was only beginning. As spring advanced across Massachusetts in 1692, the atmosphere in Salem Village grew heavier with every passing week. What had once been a collection of isolated accusations was transforming into a crisis that reached far beyond a handful of frightened families. The fear no longer belonged only to the afflicted girls, the accused women, or the local ministers. It seeped into every home, every meeting house, every field, and every road connecting neighboring settlements. People woke each morning, wondering whose name might surface next. The accusations were no longer confined to society's outsiders. During the earliest days of the panic, many residents could convince themselves that the arrested women were unusual cases. Sarah Good was poor. Sarah Osborne had long-standing disputes. Tituba occupied a vulnerable position within colonial society. Their arrests, however disturbing, could still be explained away by those who wanted to believe the danger remained limited. That illusion disappeared quickly. Martha Corey became one of the first examples. Unlike some earlier suspects, Martha enjoyed respect within the community. She was a church member. Many people viewed her as a respectable woman. Her arrest shocked observers because it challenged a comforting assumption. If a woman with a good reputation could be accused of serving dark forces, then no one was truly safe. The accusations against Martha relied heavily upon testimony from the afflicted girls. They claimed her spirit tormented them. During examinations, observers reported that whenever Martha moved, the girls reacted dramatically. If she clasped her hands, they clutched themselves. If she shifted her position, they cried out in apparent pain. To many spectators, these reactions appeared impossible to fake. Others privately harbored doubts, yet expressing skepticism had become increasingly dangerous. Anyone who openly questioned the proceedings risked attracting suspicion themselves. This reality became terrifyingly clear through the experience of Martha's husband, Giles Corey. Giles was an elderly farmer known throughout the region for his stubborn personality. He was not a man who remained silent when he disagreed with something. At first, he defended his wife. He questioned the legitimacy of the accusations and expressed concerns about the evidence being presented. Such resistance did not go unnoticed. Soon, accusations began targeting Giles himself. What made the situation particularly alarming was how quickly public opinion could shift. One day, a person might stand among the spectators. The next day, they could stand before the magistrates as a suspect. The machinery of fear had begun feeding itself. Every accusation generated new accusations. Every arrest inspired further arrests. Each confession encouraged authorities to search for additional witches. As more suspects entered prison cells, interrogators sought names. Who else participated? Who else signed the Devil's Book? Who else threatened the colony? Under immense pressure, some prisoners provided answers. Many historians believe confessions often emerged from desperation rather than guilt. Those who admitted involvement in witchcraft sometimes avoided immediate execution. Those who maintained innocence often faced harsher consequences. The system unintentionally rewarded confession. This dynamic created a powerful incentive. Once one person confessed and named others, investigators pursued those newly identified suspects. Then, additional names emerged. The cycle repeated again and again. Meanwhile, the panic spread beyond Salem Village itself. Nearby communities became entangled in the crisis. Residents from surrounding towns found themselves accused. The growing number of arrests overwhelmed local authorities. Jails filled rapidly. Conditions inside those prisons were harsh. Colonial jails were not designed for comfort. Prisoners frequently relied upon family members for food and necessities. Cells were crowded. Illness spread easily. Chains and restraints added further suffering. Many inmates spent months imprisoned before receiving formal trials. For innocent people, the experience was devastating. Families lost income while primary breadwinners sat behind bars. Farms suffered from neglect. Children faced uncertainty about their futures. Property disputes emerged as households struggled to survive. Outside prison walls, rumors continued multiplying. Some stories described spectral attacks. Others involved mysterious animals. Certain witnesses claimed they saw spirits moving through rooms. Others reported dreams, visions, or strange encounters. Today, such testimony might receive little legal weight. In 17th century New England, however, many officials considered it significant. One particularly controversial form of evidence became central to numerous cases. This was known as spectral evidence. According to this logic, an afflicted person could claim that the spirit or apparition of an accused individual attacked them, even if the accused was physically elsewhere at the time. Critics questioned whether such claims could be trusted. Could the devil impersonate innocent people? Could visions be mistaken? Could fear influence perception? These concerns would eventually play an important role in the collapse of the trials. At this stage, however, many authorities accepted spectral evidence as valid. As a result, accusations became extraordinarily difficult to disprove. How could someone prove they had not sent their spirit to torment another person? The challenge was nearly impossible. One individual whose arrest generated widespread attention was Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca was elderly, respected, and widely regarded as pious. Many neighbors found the accusations against her difficult to believe. Supporters gathered petitions defending her character. People who had known her for years struggled to reconcile the allegations with the woman they thought they understood. Yet even strong community support failed to protect her. During examinations, the afflicted girls once again claimed supernatural attacks. Observers watched dramatic performances unfold. Some considered the displays undeniable proof. Others quietly wondered whether emotion and expectation influenced events. Still, few dared challenge the dominant narrative openly. The consequences could be severe. Religious leaders throughout the colony debated the growing crisis. Ministers exchanged letters and opinions. Some strongly supported aggressive action against suspected witches. Others urged caution. One influential figure, Increase Mather, expressed concern regarding the standards of evidence being used. Although he accepted the existence of witchcraft, he worried that innocent people might suffer wrongful convictions. His concerns reflected a deeper problem. the colony faced two competing fears. One fear involved allowing witches to operate freely. The other involved executing innocent individuals. As the months passed, balancing those concerns became increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, ordinary residents found themselves trapped within an environment dominated by uncertainty. Neighbors viewed one another differently. Casual disagreements carried new significance. An argument over livestock, a dispute regarding property, a conflict between families. Any of these incidents could later resurface during an investigation. Trust eroded steadily. The social fabric holding communities together began unraveling. Even children became participants in the crisis. Young accusers gained remarkable influence. Their statements commanded attention from magistrates, ministers, and prominent citizens. Adults often treated their claims with extraordinary seriousness. This shift altered traditional power dynamics. Individuals who ordinarily possessed little authority suddenly shaped the fate of respected community members. The psychological impact was immense. Every public examination attracted crowds. People traveled considerable distances to witness proceedings. Stories circulated rapidly throughout the colony. The witch trials became the dominant topic of conversation. Yet beneath the spectacle lay genuine human suffering. Prisoners worried constantly about their futures. Families feared financial ruin. Children watched parents disappear behind prison walls. Communities fractured under mounting suspicion. By early summer, the crisis showed no signs of slowing. Instead, it intensified. Authorities established a special court to handle the growing number of cases. This development signaled a new phase. The accusations had become too numerous for ordinary procedures. Now, a formal mechanism existed to process them more efficiently. For supporters of the prosecutions, this seemed necessary. For critics, it represented a dangerous escalation. Either way, the consequences would be enormous. Soon the court would begin hearing major cases. Verdicts would be issued. Sentences would be carried out. The colony stood on the edge of its darkest chapter. The prisons were crowded. The accusations continued. The fear remained relentless. And as summer approached, Salem prepared to witness its first executions. And as summer approached, Salem prepared to witness its first executions. The arrival of June 1692 marked a turning point in the crisis. Until now, the growing panic had been driven largely by accusations, examinations, imprisonments, and confessions. Lives had already been disrupted. Families had already suffered. Yet no one had been formally executed. That was about to change. Throughout the colony, authorities faced increasing pressure to resolve the mounting number of cases. Jails were overcrowded. More suspects arrived every week. The legal system struggled to keep pace with the expanding crisis. To address the problem, Governor Sir William Phips established a special tribunal known as the Court of Oyer and Terminer. The name sounded strange, even to many colonists. Derived from old French legal terminology, it essentially meant a court empowered to hear and determine cases. Its mission was straightforward: process the growing number of witchcraft accusations that ordinary courts could no longer manage efficiently. The court included several prominent officials, among them Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton. Stoughton would become one of the most influential figures in the entire affair. Firm in his belief that witches posed a genuine threat, he approached the cases with determination. Like many of his contemporaries, he viewed the situation through a religious lens. If Satan truly operated within the colony, then decisive action seemed necessary. The first major trial involved a woman named Bridget Bishop. Unlike some earlier defendants, Bridget already carried a controversial reputation. She owned taverns. She dressed in ways some neighbors considered flashy. Various rumors had circulated about her for years. None of these characteristics proved witchcraft, of course. Yet, they made her an easier target in a society that valued conformity and religious discipline. When Bridget entered the courtroom, she faced a hostile environment. Witnesses offered testimony describing strange events. Some claimed animals appeared mysteriously around her property. Others reported unusual occurrences stretching back many years. The afflicted girls asserted that her spirit tormented them. Each accusation added another layer to the case. From a modern perspective, much of the evidence appears deeply unreliable. Stories based on dreams, visions, and supernatural encounters dominated portions of the proceedings. But to many observers in 1692, such testimony carried weight. Bridget firmly denied being a witch. She insisted upon her innocence. Again and again, she rejected the allegations. The court remained unconvinced. After deliberation, Bridget Bishop was found guilty. The verdict carried a sentence of death. On June 10, 1692, she became the first person executed during the Salem Witch Trials. News of the execution spread rapidly. For supporters of the prosecutions, the outcome represented justice. For others, it introduced a troubling reality. The crisis had crossed a new threshold. No longer were accused individuals merely imprisoned. Now people were dying. The execution did not calm fears. Instead, it intensified them. If anything, authorities interpreted the conviction as proof that witches truly existed within the colony. The machinery of accusation accelerated. New suspects continued entering prisons. Additional hearings filled court schedules. Each conviction strengthened confidence among those conducting the prosecutions. The court soon turned its attention toward other defendants. Among the most significant was Rebecca Nurse. Her case deeply divided public opinion. Rebecca was 71 years old. Many neighbors regarded her as deeply religious and morally upright. Unlike Bridget Bishop, she lacked a controversial public reputation. This fact made her prosecution particularly unsettling. If Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, who could not? Supporters rallied around her. Petitions circulated. Community members spoke positively about her character. Numerous residents testified regarding her reputation for honesty and piety. Yet the courtroom atmosphere remained heavily influenced by the afflicted accusers. Whenever Rebecca appeared, some girls reportedly screamed, convulsed, or claimed they suffered invisible attacks. Observers watched closely. The emotional intensity often overshadowed rational analysis. Initially, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. For a brief moment, it seemed Rebecca might be spared, but confusion followed. Questions arose regarding remarks she had made during the proceedings. Pressure mounted. The jury reconsidered. Eventually, the verdict changed. Rebecca Nurse was convicted. The decision stunned many observers, even some who accepted the reality of witchcraft struggled to understand how such a respected woman could be guilty. Nevertheless, the sentence stood. Rebecca joined the growing list of condemned prisoners. The court moved forward relentlessly. Another major target emerged in the form of John Proctor. John was a prosperous farmer and tavern owner. Unlike many others, he openly criticized aspects of the trials. He questioned the reliability of the accusers. He expressed concern regarding the evidence. Such skepticism made him increasingly vulnerable. Soon, accusations targeted both John and his wife, Elizabeth. The charges shocked many residents. The Proctors occupied a respected position within the community, yet respect provided little protection. As it happened before, the afflicted girls claimed supernatural attacks. Witnesses offered alarming testimony. Officials proceeded with the prosecution. John Proctor became one of the most outspoken critics. To find himself trapped within the system he opposed. His case symbolized a dangerous trend. Individuals who challenged the proceedings often found suspicion turning toward them. Fear created powerful incentives for silence. The consequences extended beyond individual defendants. Families suffered tremendously. When husbands or wives entered prison, household economies collapsed. Fields went unattended. Livestock lacked proper care. Children faced uncertainty regarding food and shelter. Legal expenses mounted. Some families sold possessions simply to survive. The trials affected entire communities rather than isolated individuals. Summer heat settled across New England, yet the atmosphere remained cold with anxiety. Every knock at the door carried potential danger. Every disagreement risked future consequences. Every rumor demanded attention. The number of imprisoned suspects continued rising. Authorities struggled to accommodate them. Some prisoners were transferred between facilities due to overcrowding. Conditions remained miserable. Chains, sickness, poor nutrition, and uncertainty wore down inmates physically and emotionally. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, influential ministers debated the crisis. Cotton Mather observed developments closely, one of the colony's most prominent religious figures. He believed witchcraft existed, but also recognized certain dangers associated with the prosecutions. His writings and correspondence would later become central to historical debates regarding responsibility for the trials. At the time, however, few individuals fully understood where events were heading. The court of Oyer and Terminer remained active. Convictions accumulated. Executions loomed. Each new case reinforced the impression that Salem faced a vast hidden conspiracy. The afflicted accusers continued identifying alleged witches. Their influence remained enormous. Magistrates listened carefully. Spectators watched intently. Journal entries recorded unfolding events. Throughout the colony, people discussed little else. By July, several condemned prisoners awaited execution. Families prayed desperately. Supporters submitted petitions. Critics voiced concerns more cautiously than ever. Yet the legal machinery continued moving forward. The coming weeks would become some of the darkest in colonial American history. More convictions were approaching. More executions were approaching. And among those awaiting judgment stood individuals whose names would be remembered for centuries as symbols of one of history's most tragic miscarriages of justice. The summer sun shone brightly over Massachusetts, but beneath that sunlight, fear still ruled Salem, and before long, the gallows would claim far more victims than Bridget Bishop alone, and before long, the gallows would claim far more victims than Bridget Bishop alone. July 1692 arrived with an uneasy stillness hanging over Massachusetts. Fields continued producing crops. Fishermen launched boats into coastal waters. Merchants traveled familiar roads between settlements. On the surface, ordinary life carried on. Yet beneath that appearance, fear dominated nearly every conversation. People no longer spoke merely about rumors. Now they spoke about executions. The death of Bridget Bishop had demonstrated that convictions could lead directly to the gallows. What had once seemed unimaginable was becoming reality. Families throughout the colony watched developments nervously, wondering whether the crisis would finally begin to slow. Instead, it accelerated. The court of Oyer and Terminer continued hearing cases at a relentless pace. The judges remained convinced that a dangerous network of witches threatened the colony. The afflicted accusers continued reporting supernatural attacks. Witnesses kept presenting alarming testimony. As a result, more guilty verdicts followed. One of the most significant cases involved Rebecca Nurse. For many residents, Rebecca represented everything a godly Puritan woman was supposed to be. She was elderly, respected, and known for her religious devotion. Even after her conviction, large numbers of people remained troubled by the outcome. Supporters struggled to believe she could truly be guilty. Yet legal proceedings had already reached a point where reputation offered little protection. On July 19, 1692, Rebecca Nurse was taken to the gallows. She did not stand alone. That same day, Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds were also executed. 5 people died together. The event shocked observers across the colony. Witnesses watched as the condemned women maintained their innocence until the end. Some prayed. Others spoke calmly despite facing death. Particularly striking was the execution of Sarah Good. Months earlier, she had become one of the first individuals accused during the initial stages of the crisis. Poor, homeless, and frequently dependent upon charity, she had long occupied a vulnerable position within Salem society. Now she faced execution for a crime she consistently denied committing. According to historical accounts, a dramatic exchange occurred shortly before her death. Reverend Nicholas Noyes reportedly urged her to confess. Sarah refused. Instead, she proclaimed her innocence and accused her persecutors of wrongdoing. Whether every detail of the story survived accurately through the years remains uncertain. But the account became one of the most famous moments associated with the trials. Meanwhile, the execution of Rebecca Nurse generated particular discomfort among many observers. People who had known her for decades struggled to reconcile her character with the accusations. If someone like Rebecca could be condemned, then the standards for guilt appeared alarmingly broad. Yet fear remained stronger than doubt. The trials continued. As summer progressed, the panic expanded geographically. The accusations were no longer concentrated solely within Salem Village. Residents from numerous communities became entangled in the investigations. Names surfaced from Andover, Ipswich, Topsfield, and other settlements. The crisis spread outward like ripples across water. Authorities pursued every lead. Every accusation demanded examination. Every confession encouraged additional investigations. The number of imprisoned suspects grew steadily. By now, many colonists had begun adjusting their behavior out of fear. People became cautious about expressing unpopular opinions. Disagreements remained unresolved rather than risk confrontation. Criticism of the trials often occurred only in private. The social atmosphere had become deeply strained. Trust continued eroding. Neighbors who once exchanged friendly greetings now viewed each other with uncertainty. A casual remark might later be interpreted as suspicious. A long-standing dispute could suddenly acquire dangerous significance. An unfortunate coincidence that might become evidence. The rules governing everyday interactions seemed increasingly unpredictable. For the accused and their families, the consequences were devastating. Property often suffered from neglect. Financial resources disappeared. Legal costs accumulated rapidly. Some prisoners remained confined for months without knowing their fate. Loved ones struggled desperately to provide support. Many households approached ruin. The emotional burden proved equally severe. Parents worried about children. Children worried about parents. Husbands and wives endured prolonged separation. Entire families lived under constant uncertainty. Within the prisons, conditions remained grim. Cells grew crowded as more inmates arrived. Disease posed a continual threat. Food quality varied significantly. Prisoners frequently depended upon relatives for survival. Those lacking outside support faced especially difficult circumstances. Yet, despite mounting hardships, authorities believed their actions remained necessary. The judges interpreted ongoing accusations as confirmation that the witchcraft conspiracy was real. Each conviction reinforced that belief. Each confession appeared to validate previous conclusions. The cycle became self-sustaining. At the same time, some observers began noticing troubling inconsistencies. Not every accusation aligned neatly with available facts. Not every witness appeared equally reliable. Questions emerged regarding the nature of spectral evidence. Could invisible attacks truly serve as proof? Could dreams and visions justify execution? Could fear influence perception? Such concerns circulated quietly at first. Most people remained reluctant to challenge official proceedings openly. The risks were simply too great. The experience of John Proctor served as a powerful warning. By criticizing aspects of the trials, he had drawn attention to himself. Now he sat imprisoned alongside numerous other suspects. His case demonstrated how quickly skepticism could become dangerous. The colony increasingly resembled a society trapped within a feedback loop. Fear generated accusations. Accusations generated arrests. Arrests generated confessions. Confessions generated further fear. Breaking that cycle proved extraordinarily difficult. August approached. Temperatures remained warm, but the emotional climate grew even more intense. New trials filled court schedules. Additional executions loomed. The authorities showed little sign of slowing their efforts. Then another major figure entered the spotlight. His name was George Burroughs. Unlike many previous defendants, Burroughs was not an ordinary villager. He had once served as minister in Salem. Educated and respected, he possessed a background that made the accusations particularly startling. Some witnesses claimed he demonstrated supernatural strength. Others accused him of leading witches. Stories surrounding his case became increasingly dramatic. For supporters of the prosecutions, His alleged involvement suggested that the conspiracy reached even into religious leadership. For critics, the charges seemed increasingly implausible. Nevertheless, Burroughs found himself facing the same machinery that had already condemned numerous others. His trial approached. His fate would soon become intertwined with one of the most memorable and controversial episodes of the entire Salem Witch Trials. Meanwhile, anxiety continued spreading throughout Massachusetts. Ordinary colonists wondered how many more arrests would occur. Would the accusations ever stop? Could anyone truly feel safe? The answers remained unclear. What was clear, however, was that the crisis had reached a level few could have imagined during those first strange incidents inside the Paris household months earlier. The panic had grown beyond individual accusations. It had become a colony-wide ordeal. And as August unfolded, Salem moved toward an even darker chapter, one that would leave some witnesses questioning everything they thought they knew about guilt, innocence, and justice. And as August unfolded, Salem moved toward an even darker chapter, one that would leave some witnesses questioning everything they thought they knew about guilt, innocence, and justice. By the beginning of August 1692, the Salem Witch Trials had evolved into something far larger than a local dispute. What had started with a handful of accusations in a small village had become one of the most significant crises in the history of colonial New England. The prisons were overflowing. The court remained active. Fear had become woven into everyday life. And yet, despite months of investigations, examinations, confessions, and executions, many people believed the worst was still ahead. One of the most important cases now facing the court involved George Burroughs. His situation differed dramatically from many earlier defendants. Burroughs was not a poor beggar. He was not an isolated outsider. He was not an elderly widow living on the margins of society. He was a former minister, educated, respected, and once trusted by members of the community. Burroughs represented the kind of individual many colonists would never have imagined standing accused of witchcraft. That was precisely why his case carried such enormous significance. If the accusations against Burroughs were true, then the supposed conspiracy reached into positions of religious authority. If the accusations were false, then something had gone terribly wrong within the judicial process. Witnesses presented astonishing claims. Some testified that Burroughs possessed supernatural strength. Stories circulated describing feats that seemed impossible for an ordinary man. Others accused him of serving as a leader among witches. The allegations grew increasingly dramatic. As had happened in previous trials, the afflicted accusers claimed they suffered attacks connected to him. Spectral evidence appeared once again. Visions, dreams, and reports of invisible encounters formed important parts of the prosecution's case. Burroughs denied everything. He maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, yet denial had become a familiar feature of the trials. The court remained unconvinced. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. On August 19, 1692, George Burroughs was led to Gallows Hill alongside several other condemned prisoners. The execution attracted considerable attention. Large crowds gathered to watch. Many expected the event to reinforce confidence in the trials. Instead, it produced one of the most remarkable moments of the entire crisis. According to numerous accounts, Burroughs addressed the crowd shortly before his death. Then he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. To modern readers, that detail may seem insignificant. To many Puritans of the 17th century, however, it carried tremendous weight. A widespread belief existed that witches could not successfully recite the Lord's Prayer without error. Burroughs completed it flawlessly. The crowd became visibly unsettled. Some spectators began questioning whether an innocent man stood before them. For a brief moment, uncertainty spread through those assembled. Had a mistake been made? Had the court condemned the wrong person? Historical reports suggest that the situation became tense. The growing doubts threatened to undermine confidence in the proceedings. At that critical moment, influential figures stepped forward to reassure the crowd that justice had been served. The execution continued. George Burroughs died alongside the others. Yet the incident left an impression. For some observers, it became one of the first major cracks in the certainty that had fueled the trials. Questions lingered. Not everyone voiced those questions publicly, but they existed. And once doubt begins to grow, it can become difficult to suppress. Despite this unsettling episode, the prosecutions continued. Additional trials moved forward. Additional prisoners awaited judgment. Among them was John Proctor. John's case had become increasingly important because he openly criticized the trials before his arrest. A successful farmer and businessman, Proctor possessed influence within the community. His objections to the proceedings were well known. He questioned the credibility of the accusers. He challenged aspects of the evidence. He worried that innocent people were suffering. Such views had made him dangerous in the eyes of many supporters of the prosecutions. Now he stood accused himself. His wife, Elizabeth Proctor, also faced charges. The accusations against the Proctors reflected a troubling pattern that some colonists had begun noticing. Individuals who challenged the process frequently became targets of suspicion, whether intentional or not. The result discouraged criticism. The message was clear. Opposition carried risks. As John awaited trial, conditions throughout the colony continued deteriorating. The panic showed few signs of slowing. In fact, it appeared to be spreading further. One community became particularly important during this stage of the crisis. That community was Andover. Residents there soon found themselves deeply entangled in the witchcraft investigations. Several accusers visited the town. Examinations took place. New suspects emerged. The number of arrests increased dramatically. Andover eventually contributed a significant portion of the accused individuals connected to the Salem crisis. The expansion alarmed many observers. What had begun in Salem Village now threatened numerous surrounding settlements. No clear boundary existed. No obvious stopping point appeared. Anyone might become a suspect. The psychological impact became enormous. People adjusted their behavior accordingly. Conversations became more cautious. Expressions of doubt became more private. Ordinary disagreements took on dangerous potential. Even small misunderstandings could have serious consequences. Many colonists found themselves living under constant stress. The uncertainty affected every aspect of life. Meanwhile, some of the afflicted accusers gained extraordinary influence. Magistrates listened carefully to their claims. Community members observed their behavior closely. Their testimony carried enormous weight during legal proceedings. Yet not everyone accepted their statements without question. Private skepticism slowly increased. Some individuals noticed inconsistencies. Others struggled to understand how so many respected people could suddenly be witches. The list of accused individuals had grown remarkably diverse. Rich and poor, young and old, church members and outsiders, men and women. The supposed conspiracy seemed to include almost every category of person imaginable. For certain observers, this breadth began raising concerns. Could so many different individuals truly belong to a coordinated network of witchcraft? Or had fear begun distorting judgment? The questions remained largely unspoken, at least for now. The court of Oyer and Terminer continued issuing convictions. Executions continued. Families continued suffering. The colony remained trapped inside a cycle of suspicion and fear. Yet beneath the surface, attitudes were beginning to shift. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually. One execution here, one questionable testimony there, one respected citizen accused, one troubling inconsistency observed. Each event planted another small seed of doubt. Individually, those doubts seemed insignificant. Collectively, they would eventually transform the course of the crisis. For the moment, however, Salem remained firmly in the grip of panic. September approached. More trials were scheduled. More prisoners awaited judgment. More lives hung in the balance. And before the month ended, the witch hunt would reach its deadliest and most brutal stage, yet claiming victims whose stories would become some of the most tragic in all of American history. And before the month ended, the witch hunt would reach its deadliest and most brutal stage, yet claiming victims whose stories would become some of the most tragic in all of American history. September 1692 began with a sense of dread spreading across Massachusetts. By now, the Salem Witch Trials had been unfolding for months. Executions had become grim realities rather than shocking exceptions. The prisons remained crowded. New accusations continued appearing. Families throughout the colony watched developments with growing anxiety. Yet even after everything that had already happened, the darkest chapter still lay ahead. The legal machinery showed little sign of stopping. Judges continued hearing cases. Accusers continued presenting testimony. Authorities continued searching for witches. At the center of the crisis stood a growing list of prisoners whose futures appeared increasingly uncertain. Among them was Giles Corey. Few stories from the Salem Witch Trials have remained as memorable or as disturbing as his. Giles was approximately 80 years old. He had spent decades working as a farmer, known for his stubborn independence. He was hardly the type of person to surrender easily under pressure. Months earlier, he had defended his wife, Martha Corey, after she was accused. Soon afterward, accusations targeted him as well. Once arrested, Giles faced a difficult decision. Colonial law contained a peculiar rule. A defendant could not be formally tried unless he entered a plea. Normally, defendants pleaded either guilty or not guilty. Giles refused to do either. Why? Historians believe he may have understood the consequences of conviction. If found guilty, his property could potentially be seized, leaving his family with little inheritance. By refusing to enter a plea, he prevented the trial from moving forward. The authorities responded with a brutal procedure known as pressing. The punishment was intended to force a plea. Giles was placed on the ground. A board was laid across his body. Heavy stones were added gradually. Again and again, officials demanded that he enter a plea. Again and again, he refused. The weight increased. The pressure intensified. Hours passed. The suffering became unimaginable. Witnesses later recalled his remarkable determination. Rather than submitting, Giles reportedly uttered only a few famous words. More weight. Whether every detail survived perfectly through history remains uncertain. What is clear is that he never entered a plea. For 2 days, the punishment continued. Finally, on September 19, 1692, Giles Corey died. He became the only victim of the Salem Witch Trials killed in this particular manner. His death shocked many observers, even among those who supported the prosecutions. The circumstances appeared extraordinarily harsh. Stories about his courage spread quickly. For some colonists, his fate became another reason to question the direction of the trials. Yet the crisis continued. Just 3 days later, another group of condemned prisoners faced execution. Among them stood John Proctor. By this point, Proctor had become one of the most prominent critics caught within the system. His opposition to the trials had been well known before his arrest. Now he faced the same fate as many others who had protested their innocence. The evidence against him followed familiar patterns. Witnesses described spectral attacks. Accusers claimed supernatural encounters. Testimony accumulated. The court found him guilty. The sentence was death. On September 22, 1692, John Proctor was led to the gallows. His wife, Elizabeth, had also been convicted, but received a temporary reprieve because she was pregnant. That circumstance spared her life for the moment. John received no such protection. He was executed alongside several others, including Martha Corey. For observers familiar with both Giles Corey and Martha Corey, the tragedy felt particularly severe. Within days, husband and wife had both died as a result of the witchcraft panic. The September 22 executions proved especially significant. 8 people were hanged that day. It was the largest single execution event of the entire Salem Witch Trials. The death toll continued rising. Families mourned. Communities struggled to comprehend the losses. Yet something important was changing beneath the surface. The confidence that had fueled the prosecutions for months was beginning to weaken. Not everywhere, not all at once, but the shift had started. Several factors contributed. One was simple arithmetic. The accusations had spread so widely that they increasingly touched respected members of society. Ministers, farmers, merchants, and church members had all become suspects. The alleged conspiracy seemed endless. Every time authorities removed one supposed witch, new accusations emerged. The problem never appeared closer to resolution. Another factor involved the quality of evidence. Spectral testimony remained controversial. Many thoughtful observers wondered whether dreams and visions should determine matters of life and death. The execution of George Burroughs had already raised concerns. His flawless recitation of the Lord's Prayer lingered in people's memories. Now additional doubts accumulated. Religious leaders also began expressing stronger reservations. Among the most influential was Increase Mather. He accepted the reality of witchcraft. Most educated people in New England did. However, he increasingly worried about convicting innocent individuals. One of his most famous arguments reflected this concern. It was better, he suggested, for several witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned. That idea gradually gained support. The statement challenged a central assumption driving the prosecutions. For months, authorities had focused primarily on eliminating perceived threats. Now some began asking whether the greater danger might actually be wrongful conviction. Governor William Phips also found himself confronting uncomfortable realities. The growing controversy surrounding the trials became difficult to ignore. Prominent citizens questioned proceedings. Public confidence weakened. The colony faced increasing instability. Meanwhile, the afflicted accusers continued making claims, yet their influence no longer seemed quite as absolute as before. Skepticism had entered the conversation. The shift remained subtle. Many colonists still believed witches existed. Many still supported investigations. But fewer people felt certain that the courts had identified the correct individuals. This distinction mattered enormously. The witchcraft panic depended upon confidence. Confidence in the accusers. Confidence in the judges. Confidence in the evidence. Once that confidence weakened, the entire structure became vulnerable. Inside the prisons, hundreds of lives remained suspended in uncertainty. Some prisoners awaited trial. Others awaited sentencing. Many hoped that changing attitudes might save them. Yet no one could predict what would happen next. The legal system remained active. The accusations had not entirely stopped. Fear still lingered across Massachusetts. But for the first time in many months, the momentum appeared different. The panic was no longer expanding as effortlessly as before. Resistance was growing. Questions were multiplying. Influential voices were speaking more cautiously. The colony stood at a crossroads. One path led toward continued executions. The other led toward reconsideration. The decision would shape the future of countless prisoners. It would determine whether the crisis intensified further or finally began to recede. As autumn settled over New England and leaves started changing color, many residents sensed that the Salem Witch Trials were entering a new phase. The violence had reached its peak. The death toll had climbed to horrifying levels. The prisons remained full, yet the certainty that once drove the prosecutions was beginning to crack, and those cracks would soon widen into something that authorities could no longer ignore. And those cracks would soon widen into something that authorities could no longer ignore. By the autumn of 1692, Massachusetts found itself exhausted. For months, accusations had dominated public life. Families had been torn apart. Prisons overflowed with suspects. Executions had transformed fear into grief. Entire communities had become trapped within a cycle of suspicion that seemed impossible to escape. Yet beneath the surface, a profound change was underway. The confidence that had once fueled the witch trials was beginning to collapse, not because people suddenly stopped believing in witchcraft. Most colonists still accepted the possibility that witches existed. The shift occurred for a different reason. Increasing numbers of people began questioning whether the courts were accurately identifying witches at all. That distinction would ultimately determine the fate of the trials. One of the most influential voices in this growing debate belonged to Increase Mather. Mather was among the most respected religious leaders in New England. His opinions carried enormous weight. Ministers, magistrates, and ordinary colonists paid attention when he spoke. Throughout much of the crisis, Mather had approached the subject carefully. He did not dismiss witchcraft. He did not deny the existence of evil. However, he became increasingly concerned about the methods being used to secure convictions. The issue that troubled him most was spectral evidence. For months, spectral evidence had formed the backbone of many prosecutions. Accusers claimed they saw spirits. They reported visions. They described invisible attacks. The courts often treated such testimony as legitimate proof. To many observers, that approach seemed increasingly dangerous. How could anyone verify a vision? How could a defendant disprove a dream? How could invisible events be examined objectively? These questions became harder to ignore with each passing week. In October, Increase Mather expressed his concerns more openly. His arguments struck directly at the heart of the prosecutions. He warned against relying too heavily upon spectral evidence. Most importantly, he emphasized a principle that would become famous throughout American history. It was better that many guilty persons escape than that one innocent person suffer. The statement resonated deeply. For months, the courts had prioritized rooting out witches at almost any cost. Mather's argument forced colonists to consider a different possibility. What if the greatest danger was not allowing witches to escape? What if the greatest danger was executing innocent people? That question lingered in minds across the colony. Meanwhile, other developments further weakened support for the trials. The accusations continued reaching prominent individuals. Some targets possessed powerful friends and political connections. Others belonged to respected families. The widening scope of the investigations alarmed many influential citizens. People who had once supported aggressive prosecutions began reconsidering their positions. Governor William Phips faced growing pressure. As the colony's chief executive, he could not ignore the controversy indefinitely. The crisis had expanded far beyond Salem Village. Its effects reached throughout Massachusetts. Political stability was at risk. Public confidence was deteriorating. The legal system itself faced scrutiny. Then events took an especially significant turn. Reports emerged that accusations had begun touching individuals connected to the governor's own circle. This development changed the political landscape dramatically. When suspicion threatens distant strangers, it is often easier to tolerate. When it approaches one's own family and associates, perspectives can change quickly. Phips grew increasingly concerned. Questions about the reliability of the proceedings multiplied. The governor now faced a difficult choice: continue supporting the existing system or intervene. In late October 1692, he made his decision. Governor Phips ordered an end to the Court of Oyer and Terminer. The special tribunal that had overseen the witchcraft prosecutions was dissolved. The announcement marked a major turning point. For months, the court had served as the engine driving convictions. Now that engine had been shut down. The decision did not immediately free prisoners. It did not instantly end accusations. It did not erase the suffering already endured, but it fundamentally altered the direction of the crisis. Without the court, the prosecutions lost much of their momentum. The colony entered a period of uncertainty. Many prisoners remained behind bars. Many families still faced hardship. Yet for the first time in months, hope began appearing. A new judicial body eventually replaced the old court. The differences proved crucial. The new judges approached cases more cautiously. Standards of evidence became stricter. Spectral evidence no longer carried the same influence. This change transformed outcomes dramatically. Cases that might once have resulted in conviction now produced acquittals. Evidence previously considered persuasive suddenly appeared questionable. The shift exposed just how heavily earlier prosecutions had depended upon controversial testimony. Meanwhile, public opinion continued evolving. Stories circulated regarding wrongful accusations. Accounts of dubious evidence gained attention. Many colonists began reflecting upon the events of the previous months. The results were unsettling. How had so many people become convinced? How had respected citizens been condemned? How had fear acquired such power? No easy answers existed. The trials had emerged from a complicated combination of religious beliefs, social tensions, personal conflicts, political uncertainty, and psychological pressures. Even participants struggled to fully understand what had happened. Inside the prisons, conditions slowly improved for some inmates. Several accused individuals were eventually released. Others saw charges dropped. Not everyone regained freedom immediately. The legal process remained slow. Families often faced significant financial burdens before securing release. Prison fees accumulated. Property had been damaged or lost. Livelihoods had disappeared. Even those who survived remained deeply affected. The emotional scars proved difficult to erase. Children had lost parents. Spouses had lost partners. Communities had lost trust. The consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. As winter approached once again, Massachusetts looked very different from the colony that had entered 1692. Months of fear had transformed society. The confidence that once drove the witch hunt had largely evaporated. In its place remained uncertainty, regret, and unanswered questions. The panic had not ended completely. Some believers still insisted witches existed. Some accusations continued appearing. But the great wave of prosecutions was breaking apart. The momentum that once seemed unstoppable had vanished. The machinery of conviction no longer operated as before. Executions ceased. acquittals increased, prison doors gradually opened, and throughout the colony, people began confronting a painful reality. The Salem Witch Trials might not represent a triumph over evil. They might represent a catastrophic mistake. For many, that possibility was almost harder to accept than the fear that had started everything. Yet evidence increasingly pointed in that direction. The courts were changing. The governor had intervened. Influential ministers had spoken out. Public confidence had collapsed. The witch hunt was losing its grip, and as 1692 drew closer to its end, Salem moved toward a period of reckoning that would force survivors to confront the consequences of one of the darkest episodes in colonial American history. And as 1692 drew closer to its end, Salem moved toward a period of reckoning that would force survivors to confront the consequences of one of the darkest episodes in colonial American history. The winter of 1692 settled over Massachusetts much as it had the year before. Snow-covered roads and fields. Cold winds swept through villages and farms. Families gathered around fireplaces, seeking warmth from the harsh New England climate. Yet despite the familiar season, the colony itself had changed dramatically. The fear that had once driven the witch hunt was fading. In its place emerged something far more uncomfortable: reflection. For months, many colonists had focused almost entirely on identifying supposed witches. Now, increasing numbers of people began examining the investigations themselves. The questions were difficult. The answers were often painful. And for many families, the damage could never be fully repaired. As the new judicial system reviewed remaining cases, a striking pattern emerged. Convictions became far less common. The same kinds of evidence that had once produced guilty verdicts now appeared much weaker. Judges showed greater caution. Spectral testimony carried less influence. Claims based solely upon dreams and visions no longer guaranteed success in court. The results were dramatic. One defendant after another began receiving acquittals. Prisoners who had spent months fearing execution suddenly found themselves facing the possibility of freedom. The transformation was remarkable. Only a short time earlier, the legal system seemed almost certain of widespread witchcraft. Now that certainty had largely disappeared. The contrast forced many observers to reconsider everything that had happened. If the evidence remained essentially the same, why were outcomes changing so dramatically? The answer became increasingly obvious. The earlier courts had accepted standards that many people no longer trusted. Governor William Phips continued distancing the colony from the most controversial aspects of the prosecutions. The special court responsible for so many convictions was gone. Executions had stopped. The political climate had shifted. The colony was moving away from the panic that had dominated much of 1692. By early 1693, large numbers of prisoners remained behind bars, despite the changing atmosphere. Many had not yet received final judgments. Others had been acquitted, but still faced practical obstacles. Freedom was not always immediate. Colonial prisons often required payment of various fees before release. For families already devastated financially, these costs created additional hardship. Imagine surviving months in prison only to discover that poverty might delay your freedom. Such situations were not uncommon. Relatives struggled desperately to gather money. Friends offered assistance when possible. Communities attempted to rebuild lives that had been shattered by the crisis. The emotional consequences proved equally severe. Many released prisoners returned home to discover that normal life no longer existed. Property had deteriorated. Businesses had failed. Relationships had changed. Neighbors who once offered friendship sometimes avoided them. Trust had been damaged throughout entire communities. Rebuilding would require years. For the families of those who had been executed, the pain was even greater. No acquittal could restore a lost parent. No legal reform could bring back a husband or wife. No change in public opinion could erase the memory of the gallows. Widows faced uncertain futures. Children grew up without mothers or fathers. Entire households struggled to survive. The human cost of the witch trials extended far beyond the official death toll. Among the surviving accused, many carried emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Some had endured months of imprisonment. Others had watched friends or relatives die. Many experienced the profound trauma of being publicly labeled servants of Satan. Even after release, such memories could not simply disappear. Meanwhile, attention increasingly turned toward the accusers. During the height of the panic, their testimony had influenced courts, ministers, and government officials. Now people viewed those same accusations differently. Questions emerged regarding how the events had unfolded. Were the accusers deliberately lying? Were they genuinely convinced of what they reported? Were psychological pressures involved? Could fear itself have shaped their perceptions? These questions remain subjects of debate even centuries later. Historians continue examining possible explanations. What is clear is that the social environment of Salem had been extraordinarily intense. Religious anxiety, community tensions, political uncertainty, personal rivalries, and widespread fear all combined to create conditions unlike ordinary life. Within that environment, events developed in ways few participants could have predicted. As 1693 progressed, more prisoners gained freedom. The legal system steadily moved away from the assumptions that had fueled the earlier prosecutions. Eventually, most remaining suspects were released. The great wave of accusations had finally broken. The Salem Witch Trials were were effectively over, yet endings in history are rarely clean. The official proceedings may have concluded, but the consequences continued unfolding. People remembered, families remembered, communities remembered, and memory often proved as powerful as fear. Many individuals who had supported the prosecutions found themselves confronting uncomfortable realities. Some experienced genuine regret. Others attempted to justify past actions. Still others remained convinced that witches had existed despite acknowledging mistakes in particular cases. Human reactions varied considerably. There was no single response. However, one broad trend became increasingly visible. Confidence in the trials continued declining. The certainty that once seemed absolute now appeared fragile. This shift reached even some participants who had played important roles during the crisis. Over time, several individuals expressed remorse regarding their involvement. Some jurors later acknowledged mistakes. Certain witnesses reconsidered earlier testimony. Public admissions of regret slowly entered the historical record. These developments mattered because they demonstrated how dramatically perceptions had changed. What once seemed unquestionable now appeared deeply troubling. Throughout Massachusetts, communities attempted to move forward. Fields still required planting. Businesses still required management. Children still required education. Life continued, yet the shadow of Salem remained. Stories circulated from village to village. Travelers discussed the trials. Ministers reflected upon lessons learned. Ordinary colonists debated what had happened and why. The events became a cautionary tale, even within the lifetimes of those who experienced them. As years passed, the memory of the witch trials did not disappear. Instead, it evolved. What had begun as a desperate search for hidden evil gradually became a warning about the dangers of fear, suspicion, and unchecked authority. The transformation occurred slowly. At first, survivors simply focused on rebuilding, recovering lost property, repairing damaged relationships, providing for families, healing emotional wounds. But eventually, broader questions emerged. How could such a tragedy have happened? What conditions allowed it? Could it happen again? These questions would echo through generations. For now, however, in the early months of 1693, the immediate concern remained survival. Hundreds of people were attempting to rebuild their lives. Some succeeded more easily than others. Many never fully recovered. The colony itself carried deep scars. The panic had ended. The executions had ended. The trials had ended. But the reckoning had only begun. And over the coming years, Salem would be forced to confront not only what had happened, but also what responsibility its people bore for allowing it to happen in the first place. And over the coming years, Salem would be forced to confront not only what had happened, but also what responsibility its people bore for allowing it to happen in the first place. When the final prisoners returned home and the courtrooms fell silent, many residents hoped life would simply return to normal. But history rarely allows such easy endings. The Salem Witch Trials had left wounds that could not be repaired merely by ending the prosecutions. Too many people had suffered. Too many families had been broken apart. Too many graves now existed where living neighbors should have stood. The colony entered a period of uneasy reflection. At first, that reflection happened quietly. Few people wanted to discuss the painful events openly. Many participants felt embarrassed. Others felt guilty. Some remained defensive. Still others preferred not to think about the subject at all. Yet the memory of the trials lingered everywhere. Residents passed the homes of executed neighbors. Children grew up hearing stories about relatives who had been imprisoned. Families remembered lost property, damaged reputations, and shattered friendships. The past refused to disappear. As years passed, more people began questioning their own actions during the crisis. One of the most remarkable developments involved members of the juries that had delivered guilty verdicts. Several jurors eventually expressed deep regret regarding their participation. This was no small matter. During the trials, many had sincerely believed they were protecting their communities from dangerous supernatural forces. They did not view themselves as villains. They believed they were serving justice. Yet hindsight revealed something different. The evidence that once seemed convincing now appeared unreliable. The confidence that once felt justified now seemed misplaced. In 1697, an extraordinary event took place. The Massachusetts government declared a day of fasting and reflection concerning the tragedy. For many colonists, this represented an acknowledgement that serious mistakes had occurred. The decision carried symbolic importance. Public authorities rarely admitted wrongdoing so openly, yet the scale of the disaster made silence increasingly difficult. Among those who publicly expressed remorse was Samuel Sewall. Sewall had served as one of the judges during the trials. His role placed him near the center of the crisis. Years later, he took a remarkable step. Standing before his congregation, he acknowledged responsibility and sought forgiveness for his part in the proceedings. This act distinguished him from many other officials. Public admissions of error were not easy, especially for someone of Sewall's status. Yet he chose to make one. The moment became one of the most famous examples of repentance connected to Salem. Not everyone followed his example. Some participants defended their actions until the end of their lives. Others avoided discussing the trials altogether. Human beings respond to guilt in different ways. Some confront it directly. Some deny it. Some attempt to justify past decisions. The Salem Witch Trials produced every possible reaction. Meanwhile, surviving victims and their families pursued justice of a different kind. They sought restoration. Reputations had been destroyed. Property had been confiscated. Names had been stained by accusations of witchcraft. Many families wanted official recognition that their loved ones had been wronged. Achieving that recognition proved difficult. Governments do not always move quickly. Political leaders often hesitate to revisit embarrassing episodes. Nevertheless, pressure gradually increased. Petitions appeared. Requests for compensation emerged. Supporters argued that innocent people had suffered tremendous injustice. Over time, authorities began responding. Some convictions were reversed. Certain families received financial compensation. Official records slowly changed. These actions could not erase the past. They could not bring back the dead, but they represented important acknowledgments of wrongdoing. For surviving relatives, such recognition mattered deeply. The process unfolded gradually across many years. The road toward accountability proved long. The emotional burden remained heavy. Consider the children whose parents had been executed. Some spent the rest of their lives carrying those memories. Consider the spouses left behind. Many struggled financially after losing family members. Consider the accused who survived imprisonment. Even after release, they often faced lingering suspicion. Trauma does not vanish simply because a court changes its mind. Communities throughout the region faced another challenge as well. Trust had been damaged. Neighbors had accused neighbors. Friends had testified against friends. Family members had sometimes turned against one another. Repairing those relationships proved extraordinarily difficult. People remembered who had spoken against them. They remembered who remained silent. They remembered who offered support and who did not. The social consequences extended far beyond the legal system. In some cases, bitterness lasted for generations. Families passed stories from parent to child. Local histories preserved memories of the crisis. The witch trials became part of community identity. At the same time, scholars, ministers, and political leaders increasingly studied the events for lessons. Why had the panic spread so rapidly? Why had so many intelligent people accepted questionable evidence? Why had fear overwhelmed caution? These questions fascinated observers. The answers were complicated. Religious beliefs played a role. Social tensions contributed. Economic pressures mattered. Political uncertainty influenced events. Psychological factors shaped behavior. No single explanation could fully account for what happened. Instead, the tragedy emerged from numerous forces interacting simultaneously. This complexity is one reason the Salem Witch Trials continue attracting attention centuries later. The story cannot be reduced to a simple narrative. It involves ordinary people confronting extraordinary circumstances. It reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of human communities. It demonstrates how fear can reshape perception. It illustrates how institutions can fail. Most importantly, it shows how sincere beliefs can sometimes produce devastating consequences. The people involved were not cartoon villains. Many genuinely thought they were protecting society. Many believed they were acting morally. Yet good intentions alone proved insufficient. Without skepticism, evidence, and restraint, even well-meaning individuals contributed to catastrophe. As the 18th century progressed, the memory of Salem evolved further. The immediate emotions of fear and grief gradually transformed into historical reflection. New generations examined the trials from a greater distance. The events increasingly became a lesson rather than a lived experience. Writers discussed them. Religious leaders referenced them. Political thinkers drew conclusions from them. The story survived because it spoke to universal concerns. How should societies respond to fear? How should courts evaluate evidence? How should communities balance security with justice? These questions remained relevant long after the final witchcraft accusations faded. By the early 1700s, many colonists viewed Salem not as a triumph over evil, but as a warning about human error. That transformation represented one of the most significant consequences of the entire episode. The meaning of the trials had changed, and over the decades ahead, that meaning would continue evolving, eventually turning Salem into one of the most powerful cautionary tales in American history. The panic was over. The executions were over. The legal battles were largely over. But the legacy of Salem was only beginning to take shape. And that legacy would prove far more enduring than anyone living in 1692 could possibly have imagined. And that legacy would prove far more enduring than anyone living in 1692 could possibly have imagined. As the 18th century moved forward, the people who had lived through the Salem Witch Trials gradually grew older. Some carried guilt, some carried grief, some carried memories they preferred never to discuss. Others spent years trying to understand what had happened. The trials themselves had ended, but their consequences continued echoing through families, churches, courtrooms, and government institutions. What made Salem unusual was not simply the tragedy. History contains many tragedies. What made Salem remarkable was the way later generations remembered it. The events became more than a local disaster. They became a lesson, a warning, a symbol, and eventually one of the most famous episodes in all of American history. In the years immediately following the crisis, efforts continued to repair some of the damage. Families sought legal recognition that their relatives had been wrongly accused. Petitions reached colonial authorities. Community leaders debated how to address the lingering consequences. The process moved slowly. Political systems rarely correct mistakes quickly, yet pressure continued building. People wanted official acknowledgement. They wanted justice, even if justice arrived too late for those who had already died. During the early 18th century, several convictions were formally reversed. Compensation was awarded to some affected families. These actions represented important steps. However, they could never fully erase what had happened. A government might restore a name on paper. It could not restore a lost life. A court might admit error. It could not return a parent to a child. The limits of legal correction became painfully obvious. Nevertheless, the efforts mattered. They demonstrated that at least some officials recognized the enormity of the mistakes. Meanwhile, New England itself was changing. The colonies continued growing. Population increased. Trade expanded. New towns emerged. Political ideas evolved. The world that had produced the Salem Panic slowly transformed. Religious life changed as well. Puritan influence remained significant. But the rigid social environment of the late 17th century gradually softened in some respects. New intellectual movements encouraged greater emphasis on reason and evidence. Scientific thinking became increasingly influential. People still believed in God. Many still believed in supernatural forces, but attitudes toward extraordinary claims began shifting. This broader cultural transformation affected how later generations interpreted Salem. Instead of viewing the trials primarily as a battle against witchcraft, more observers began examining them as examples of human failure. They asked different questions. Why did people believe such accusations? Why did courts accept such evidence? Why did fear spread so quickly? The focus moved away from witches and toward society itself. This change proved enormously important. By the time the United States emerged as an independent nation in the late 18th century, Salem had already become part of a larger conversation about justice and government. American political leaders frequently discussed the dangers of concentrated power. They worried about protecting individual rights. They debated the importance of fair legal procedures. Although Salem was not always mentioned directly, its lessons lingered in the background. The trials served as reminders of what could happen when fear overwhelmed due process. The memory persisted through stories passed down within families. Children learned about relatives who had been accused. Grandparents described the panic to younger generations. Local histories preserved details. Church records preserved names. The past remained alive. As the 19th century arrived, interest in Salem grew even further. Writers became fascinated by the story. Historians examined surviving documents. Authors explored the emotional and moral dimensions of the tragedy. One of the most influential figures to engage with Salem's legacy was Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne possessed a personal connection to the trials. One of his ancestors had served as a judge during the witchcraft prosecutions. The knowledge troubled him throughout his literary career. Themes of guilt, judgment, and moral responsibility appeared repeatedly in his work. His famous novel, The Scarlet Letter, reflected many of the concerns associated with Puritan society and public condemnation. Although it was not specifically about Salem, the historical shadow remained visible. Other writers also contributed to preserving public interest. Newspapers published articles, historical societies collected records, scholars examined testimony and court documents. The story refused to fade. Part of its enduring appeal came from its complexity. Simple historical events often disappear from public memory. Salem did not. Too many mysteries remained. Why did the afflicted girls behave as they did? Were they deliberately deceiving people? Did they genuinely believe their experiences? Were psychological factors involved? Could illness have played a role? Historians proposed numerous theories. No single explanation gained universal acceptance. The uncertainty itself kept interest alive. Another reason Salem endured involved its broader message. People recognized parallels between the trials and later events. Again and again, throughout history, societies experienced periods of fear. Again and again, accusations spread rapidly. Again and again, communities searched for enemies within. Salem became a powerful example of how such processes could unfold. The story seemed timeless. Whenever fear encouraged people to abandon fairness, Salem appeared relevant. Whenever public hysteria threatened reason, Salem appeared relevant. Whenever accusations outran evidence, Salem appeared relevant. Its lessons extended far beyond colonial Massachusetts. The physical landscape of Salem also contributed to the story's survival. Visitors traveled to locations associated with the trials. Historic buildings attracted attention. Local traditions preserved memories. Over time, Salem developed a unique relationship with its past. The city became both a place of historical reflection and a destination for curious travelers. Generations of visitors arrived hopping to understand what had happened. Some sought historical knowledge. Others sought emotional connection. Many simply wanted to stand where history unfolded. By the 20th century, the Salem Witch Trials occupied a permanent place within American culture. School children learned about them. Universities studied them. Books explored them. Films dramatized them. The story evolved into one of the best-known examples of mass panic and wrongful accusation in world history. The victims themselves remained central to this legacy. People continued remembering names such as Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Martha Corey, Giles Corey, George Burroughs, and many others. Their experiences transformed abstract lessons into human stories. Without those individuals, Salem might have become merely a historical curiosity. Because of them, it remained deeply personal. Readers could imagine their fears. Visitors could imagine their suffering. Future generations could recognize the human cost behind the statistics. As decades turned into centuries, the significance of Salem only grew. The events of 1692 became more than history. They became a mirror, a way for societies to examine themselves, a reminder that fear can distort judgment, a reminder that certainty can be dangerous, a reminder that justice requires evidence, caution, and humility. The people who lived through the witch trials could never have imagined the attention their story would receive hundreds of years later. Yet that attention continued growing, and as the modern world emerged, Salem's legacy entered an entirely new chapter, one in which historians, psychologists, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens would continue debating the dark truth behind the witch trials and what they reveal about human nature itself. And as the modern world emerged, Salem's legacy entered an entirely new chapter, one in which historians, psychologists, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens would continue debating the dark truth behind the witch trials and what they reveal about human nature itself. For the people who lived through the Salem witch trials, the events seemed terrifyingly real. They believed witches existed. They believed Satan actively sought to corrupt their communities. They believed invisible spiritual warfare influenced daily life. To modern readers, these assumptions can appear strange, yet understanding Salem requires recognizing that most participants operated within a worldview very different from our own. The question that has fascinated scholars for centuries is not simply what happened. The records tell us much of that story. The deeper mystery is why it happened. Why did a relatively small group of accusations spiral into a crisis that imprisoned hundreds, executed innocent people, and traumatized an entire colony? Why did so many intelligent individuals accept evidence that now appears deeply flawed? And perhaps most importantly, could something similar happen again? These questions have generated countless books, articles, debates, and theories. Historians continue examining surviving court documents. Psychologists analyze group behavior. Medical researchers explore possible illnesses. Sociologists investigate community tensions. Each discipline offers different insights. None provides a complete answer. One of the most influential explanations focuses on what is commonly called mass hysteria. Today, many experts prefer terms such as mass psychogenic illness, but the general concept remains similar. The theory suggests that psychological stress can sometimes spread through groups, producing real symptoms without a clear physical cause. People experiencing such episodes are not necessarily pretending. The symptoms can feel completely genuine. Throughout history, similar incidents have appeared in schools, factories, religious communities, and other social environments. Supporters of this explanation point toward the afflicted girls. The strange behaviors reported in early 1692 included screaming, trembling, convulsions, unusual movements, and claims of invisible attacks. Could psychological pressures have contributed? Some scholars believe so. The girls lived in a society characterized by strict religious expectations. Life was often difficult. Disease, violence, and uncertainty were common realities. Children possessed relatively little personal freedom. Within such an environment, stress might have manifested in unusual ways. If one individual displayed symptoms, others might unconsciously adopt similar behaviors. The reactions could spread through observation and expectation. This theory helps explain certain aspects of the crisis. However, it does not explain everything, even if psychological factors influenced the initial accusations. Additional questions remain. Why did judges accept the testimony? Why did respected adults support the prosecutions? Why did the panic continue for so many months? Clearly, more than one factor was involved. Another famous theory emerged during the 20th century. It focused on a fungus, specifically a fungus known as ergot. Ergot sometimes grows on rye grain under particular conditions. Consumption of contaminated rye can produce serious symptoms. In extreme cases, hallucinations, muscle spasms, and strange sensations may occur. Some researchers proposed that ergot poisoning might explain the behavior of the afflicted individuals. The idea attracted significant attention. At first glance, it seemed promising. Certain symptoms described during the trials appeared consistent with known effects of ergot exposure. New England's climate occasionally provided suitable conditions for fungal growth. The theory generated considerable discussion among historians and scientists, yet it also faced criticism. Many experts pointed out weaknesses. Not all reported symptoms matched ergot poisoning. The geographic distribution of cases created problems. Some afflicted individuals recovered unexpectedly. Others displayed behaviors difficult to reconcile with the theory. Over time, most historians concluded that ergot poisoning alone could not adequately explain the entire crisis. It remains an interesting possibility regarding certain aspects of the events, but few scholars view it as a complete solution. Other medical explanations have also appeared. Researchers have suggested various neurological conditions. Some have proposed infectious diseases. Others have explored autoimmune disorders. Each theory attempts to explain at least part of the mystery, yet every explanation encounters limitations. The evidence available after more than 3 centuries remains incomplete. No surviving records allow definitive diagnosis. The passage of time creates unavoidable uncertainty. Beyond medicine and psychology, historians emphasize social conflict. This perspective focuses less on individual symptoms and more on community dynamics. Salem was not a harmonious village before the accusations began. Long-standing disputes existed. Families argued over land. Economic competition created resentment. Religious disagreements divided residents. Political tensions affected local governance. The community contained numerous fault lines. When the accusations emerged, these existing conflicts may have shaped who became targets. Historians have identified patterns suggesting that personal rivalries sometimes influenced allegations. Certain families appeared more likely to accuse specific neighbors. Old disputes occasionally resurfaced during investigations. In this interpretation, witchcraft accusations became one way of expressing deeper social tensions. The theory does not require deliberate conspiracy. People may have genuinely believed the accusations, yet subconscious biases could still influence their judgments. Another area of research examines gender. Most accused witches were women. This fact has prompted scholars to explore how gender expectations influenced the trials. Women who deviated from social norms sometimes attracted suspicion. Widows, outspoken individuals, property owners, and those who challenged traditional roles occasionally faced greater scrutiny. However, the gender explanation also has limits. Men were accused as well. George Burroughs, John Proctor, Giles Corey, and others demonstrate that the panic extended beyond women alone. The reality appears more complicated than any single factor. Religious belief remains central to nearly every serious explanation. The Puritans of New England lived within a profoundly spiritual worldview. God and Satan were not abstract concepts. They were active realities. Natural disasters, illnesses, and personal misfortunes often carried religious significance. Understanding this mindset is essential. Without it, the behavior of many participants becomes difficult to comprehend. The judges, ministers, accusers, and spectators were not acting irrationally according to their own assumptions. They were responding logically to what they believed was true. The tragedy emerged because some of those assumptions proved deeply unreliable. Modern legal scholars often focus on the judicial aspects of Salem. For them, the trials provide a powerful case study in procedural failure. The courts accepted weak evidence. Standards of proof deteriorated. Emotional testimony overwhelmed objective evaluation. Defendants struggled to defend themselves against invisible crimes. From a legal perspective, Salem illustrates the dangers of abandoning due process. The lessons remain relevant centuries later. Perhaps that is one reason the story continues attracting attention. The witch trials are not merely about witches. They are about fear. They are about certainty. They are about the temptation to believe accusations without sufficient evidence. They are about the risks societies face when panic overrides caution. Each generation sees something different in Salem. Historians see a historical puzzle. Psychologists see group behavior. Legal scholars see courtroom failures. Sociologists see community conflict. Religious thinkers see spiritual and moral questions. The story supports multiple interpretations because the event itself was shaped by numerous forces acting simultaneously. No single explanation fully solves the mystery, and that may be the most unsettling truth of all. The Salem Witch Trials were not caused by one villain, one illness, one conspiracy, or one mistake. They emerged from fear, belief, tension, uncertainty, and human fallibility interacting together. That complexity makes the story difficult to explain. It also makes the story impossible to forget. More than 300 years later, scholars still debate the causes. Books continue appearing. Research continues evolving. Questions remain unanswered. And as we move closer to understanding the darkest truths behind Salem, another realization begins to emerge. The most frightening aspect of the witch trials may not be what they reveal about 17th century New England. It may be what they reveal about human beings in every era of history. It may be what they reveal about human beings in every era of history. That realization is one reason the Salem Witch Trials have never truly faded into the past. 3 centuries have passed since the executions on Gallows Hill. The villages have changed. The colonies became a nation. Entire generations have come and gone. Yet the story continues to feel strangely familiar. Not because modern societies believe in witches the same way 17th century Puritans did, but because the underlying forces that drove the panic still exist. Fear still exists. Suspicion still exists. Rumors still exist. The desire to identify enemies still exists. Human nature has changed far less than technology, politics, or culture. That uncomfortable truth explains why Salem remains relevant. Again and again throughout history, societies have experienced their own versions of witch hunts. The targets may differ. The accusations may differ. The language may differ. Yet the patterns often look remarkably similar. A threat appears. Fear spreads. People demand action. Evidence standards weaken. Accusations multiply. Doubt becomes dangerous. And ordinary individuals find themselves caught inside forces larger than themselves. One of the most frequently cited examples occurred during the 20th century in the United States. During the early years of the Cold War, fear of communist influence spread across the country. Government investigations sought to identify suspected communists and sympathizers. Careers were destroyed. Reputations were damaged. Accusations sometimes carried enormous consequences, even when evidence remained uncertain. Many observers noticed parallels with Salem. The term witch hunt entered political language partly because the comparison felt so powerful. People recognized familiar patterns. Fear had once again encouraged society to view suspicion as proof. The comparison did not suggest identical circumstances. The details differed significantly, yet the broader lesson remained. When communities become consumed by anxiety, fairness often suffers. Salem provided a historical warning. Unfortunately, history demonstrates that warnings are not always enough. Similar dynamics have appeared in many places and periods. Sometimes political movements create them. Sometimes religious tensions create them. Sometimes social media accelerates them. Sometimes they emerge from entirely different causes. The details chain. The psychology often remains surprisingly consistent. Human beings possess a powerful tendency to seek certainty during uncertain times. That instinct can be helpful. It can also be dangerous. The Salem Witch Trials illustrate what happens when certainty becomes disconnected from evidence. The judges believed they were protecting society. Many accusers believed they were telling the truth. Numerous spectators believed justice was being served. Yet sincere belief alone did not prevent tragedy. In some ways, sincere belief made the tragedy more likely. People rarely commit harmful actions because they think they are doing wrong. More often, they convince themselves they are doing right. That lesson may be among Salem's most important contributions to history. The victims were not destroyed by obvious villains. They were destroyed by neighbors, by officials, by community members, by ordinary people acting within systems they believed were justified. The realization remains unsettling. It forces us to ask difficult questions. Could we recognize a similar situation while living through it? Would we challenge weak evidence if everyone around us accepted it? Would we defend unpopular individuals against public opinion? Would we speak up when fear dominated the conversation? Most people like to imagine they would. History suggests the answer is often more complicated. The people of Salem did not know they were creating a cautionary tale. They believed they were confronting a crisis. Only later generations could see the larger picture. That fact should inspire humility. It reminds us that future generations may judge our own actions differently than we judge them ourselves. Modern historians frequently emphasize this point. The value of studying Salem is not simply learning about the past. It is learning about ourselves. The trials reveal how communities function under pressure. They reveal how institutions can fail. They reveal how emotions influence decision-making. They reveal how difficult it can be to distinguish truth from fear when uncertainty dominates public life. The story also demonstrates the importance of safeguards, fair trials, reliable evidence, independent courts, open debate, the presumption of innocence. These principles exist partly because societies learned painful lessons from episodes like Salem. They are not merely legal technicalities. They are protections developed through experience. The victims of Salem paid a terrible price for the absence of those protections. When we remember their stories, we remember why such safeguards matter. Today, visitors travel to Salem from around the world. They walk streets connected to the events of 1692. They visit memorials. They read names engraved in stone. They learn about the men and women who lost their lives. Some arrive expecting a story about witches. Many leave understanding that the story is really about people, about fear, about justice, about power, about responsibility, and about the consequences that follow when those forces become unbalanced. The names endure: Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Martha Corey, Giles Corey, George Burroughs, Sarah Good, and many others. Some were executed. Some survived imprisonment. All became part of a story far larger than themselves. A story that continues speaking across centuries. As we reach the end of this journey, the darkest truth about the Salem Witch Trials becomes clearer. The tragedy was not caused by magic. It was not caused by supernatural forces. It was caused by ordinary human weaknesses, amplified by extraordinary circumstances. Fear overwhelmed reason. Assumptions replaced evidence. Suspicion replaced trust. And once those changes occurred, the consequences became devastating. The story of Salem endures because it warns us that such things are never impossible. Not in 1692. Not in 1792. Not in 1892. Not in 1992. And not today. The snow-covered village, where the panic began, has long since changed. The courtrooms are silent. The prisons are empty. The gallows are gone. Yet the lessons remain, waiting for each new generation to decide whether it will remember them. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.